Girard makes the case that, what we need to complete Darwin is an account of hominization, in other words, of how humans become religious beings. So René Girard was, by most standards, a very successful academic career-wise. He came to the United States as a relatively young man, spent most of the rest of his career in the US, only making periodic visits back to France. And during his career, he held appointments at Johns Hopkins, Cornell, Stanford, and other institutions. And so, he was largely rewarded for his work, particularly his first two books, Deceit, Desire in the Novel, and Violence in the Sacred, were quite successful and influential. And yet, particularly towards the later part of his career, he became something of an untimely thinker and was broadly unfashionable in the academic humanities, which is where he had made most of his career, in essentially literature departments. Now, I think one reason for this is that he, even though he continued to focus heavily on the close interpretation of textual evidence in the way that one would expect of a literature professor, he also was not particularly interested in disciplinary boundaries, so one could say he sort of transgressed from his original field of modern French literature into realms like ancient Greek myth and drama, the Bible, and anthropology. And so he didn't really, he wasn't much concerned with academic, and perhaps interestingly for somebody who was so interested in the stabilizing role of boundaries and borders and differentiation, he was actually not particularly concerned with respecting the boundaries that existed within academia in his time. And this is part of why his work is so remarkably ambitious in its scope, which again was, I think, particularly in the later part of his career, not well regarded or well rewarded in much of the academic world, where the impetus had instead become to specialize, to carve out relatively narrow niches that you researched exhaustively, rather than attempting to come up with grand theories of society and culture as he did. So he benefited earlier in his career from the fact that the American university itself was changing, it was expanding, and many of the sort of intellectual assumptions and values that had previously informed universities came into question. Here we might think of the 1960s, right, which is when he made his early career, where there were all kinds of challenges to, the way that various subjects were taught, as well as to academic, values and hierarchies themselves. So at this time, there was an interest in thinkers who could offer new paradigms, right? Who could go beyond existing paradigms and offer new ways of thinking about the world. And so Girard took up this challenge and, was initially quite, remarkably rewarded for his work in defining the concept of mimetic desire and, the related concepts that he derived from that discovery. So his later sort of marginality and unfashionableness, I think, is partly due to the fact that once this period of sort of ferment and of paradigms being overturned and new paradigms being established was past, it turned out that essentially the kind of paradigmatic reorientation he was proposing was not the one that broadly caught on, right? And instead, the ones that caught on in the humanities tended to be those associated with postmodernism and post-structuralism, right? Which Girard, had some relations to historically and biographically, but also had quite a bit of skepticism of. And so I think, his opposition to these realms really boiled down in the end to his belief that a kind of absolute truth was possible, right? That, kind of in keeping with this general tendency towards kind of fragmentation, towards, smaller and narrower areas of research that were, the sort of expected preoccupations of academics. The sort of broadly postmodern worldview emphasized a kind of a multiplicity of possible truths, as we often know, right? An insistence that there was no final or absolute truth, and a sort of sense that, all different paths and different, manners of apprehending truth were potentially acceptable, right? However, what this foreclosed was the kind of strong truth claim that Girard was bold enough to make, right? And I think later in his career was seen as overly ambitious and often reductionist for believing that all variety of cultural phenomena could be reduced to several essential patterns, such as mimetic desire and scapegoating. So Girard's insistence on the possibility of discovering, of apprehending, and sort of tracing these fundamental truths, again, set him at odds with this more relativistic and pluralistic sensibility that had taken hold in academia. And interestingly, it set him at odds with this sensibility in two seemingly opposite ways, which is that on one hand, he was far more appreciative of and far more influenced by what we might call the hard sciences than, most humanities academics of his generation were, right? Who famously were often accused of sort of relativizing even scientific truth, right? And claiming things like, the great scientific discoveries were really just the kind of local knowledge of the West, or of, Europe or something like that. And so, for Girard, Darwin was a crucial influence, I would say. He really understood himself as working in the lineage of Darwin and of, in a sense, completing Darwin's project. And he makes this clear in his arguably magnum opus, Things Hidden, in which he makes the case that, what we need to complete Darwin is an account of hominization, in other words, of how humans become cultural beings, which for him means also religious beings, right? How we become the type of beings who create cultural complexes like mythology, like ritual, and who, see ourselves as existing in relation to transcendent beings like gods, right? So his question that he did not believe that Darwin and did not believe that later kind of evolutionary psychologists had really managed to resolve was that, right? How do humans go from this kind of biological substrate into becoming cultural and as I said, religious beings? And he did believe that the hypothesis he proposed about this, which was essentially that the spontaneous emergence of the scapegoat mechanism is the source of this entire set of phenomena. He did believe that was not simply a relative or culturally particular truth, but an absolute and universal one. And so on that level, he again saw his project as continuous with and compatible with, say, the Darwinian account of evolution and other kind of scientific, major scientific insights. But on the other hand, and this is sort of the paradox, he also took seriously the claims of a particular, let's say, cultural milieu that in general in this world of postmodern multiplicity and plurality was the one prescribed type of truth, the one kind of claim that you could not take seriously, or put simply, the claims of the Bible, right, of biblical religion and of Judaism and particularly Christianity, right, and that these documents were not merely historical and cultural and literary documents to be mined and interpreted in the way you would any other literary texts, but were actually themselves the source of profound discoveries, which for Girard were more profound than the major discoveries of the social sciences, for example, right? He believed that the Bible contained insights into human psychology and human sociology, we might say, that, in a sense, both anticipated the most significant insights of modern psychology and sociology, and also, were more fully developed and more profound in their implications than any of these sort of modern insights, which he saw as largely derivative of them. And so in this way, Girard sees both the hard sciences, biology, evolutionary biology, but also biblical religion as profound sources of insight greater than that of most of the luminaries of the humanities. And so for this reason, he is fundamentally at odds with the sort of postmodern relativistic paradigms that emerged through the 60s and 70s when he was coming into his own as a thinker and writer. It's not surprising that Girard went through a period of unfashionableness or untimeliness. When I said untimely, I was sort of thinking of Nietzsche, right, who similarly, was largely neglected. His books sold very poorly. I mean, he far more than Girard, right, was really kind of a failure in his own time, at least career-wise, right? He basically couldn't sort of hack it in academia for, reasons of health and so on. And he was also kind of canceled. And so he really retreated into this kind of internal exile. Nietzsche did. And obviously it took some decades before he really, and then he received a kind of appreciation based on the distorted readings that were, filtered, through which his work was filtered by his sister, who's famously a Nazi. So, he also had this period of, even greater obscurity, I would say. So it's not surprising that Girard, went through this period of relative obscurity. Again, not as severe as some other thinkers who we now recognize as having been, the most insightful of their time. But I would say that Girard, to the extent that he's having some kind of resurgence, this really does have to do with the, I see him as having come up in the same period that, American universities, to some extent universities worldwide, were undergoing these kinds of internal revolutions on the level of, pedagogy, on the level of curriculum, on the level of how they're managed. And they, he at this point, proposed a radical new paradigm, right? This paradigm was largely not accepted, right? But the paradigms that were embraced in its place or instead of his, I think have in some ways become exhausted, and have kind of reached their limits. One point we might, a sort of Girardian way of thinking about this is that, I brought up this notion of a sort of relativist, cultural relativism, let's say. What's kind of interesting about the moment at which that becomes, I have friends who are anthropologists, the moment at which it becomes verboten to make universal truth claims in anthropology, right? Interestingly, it also happens to be the moment of globalization, right, where, the idea of cultures as just these kind of self-enclosed systems that, have to be understood entirely on their own terms and not in relation to any other, becomes increasingly unviable because the number of cultures that are actually isolated from any others is getting smaller and smaller, and now such cultures barely exist. And so, this is also a point of how I think Girard would say that this kind of postmodern, cultural relativism was an attempt to reinstall a kind of sense of difference, right? That would sort of insulate cultures from these various kinds of threats that they seem to face, right? You can think here of a foundational text of modern anthropology is Lévi-Strauss's Twist Tropique, right? Which is really preoccupied with the way that the cultures that Levi-Strauss is visiting and studying are sort of, being eroded in their specificity by the effects of sort of technological and capitalist globalization, right? And so in a way, anthropology comes to see its purpose as partly to kind of help protect and insulate these cultures that it studies from these foreign influences. So, so this, and this goes back to another point, which is that this seeming relativism, right, and value relativism is in fact informed by a kind of moral universalism, right, which is that you seek out victims and posit yourself as their protector, right? And of course, this for Girard is an ideology ultimately derived from, although also kind of degenerated from, Christianity, right? But one way of thinking about the exhaustion of this kind of paradigm, which particularly explains why Girard's insights were not really embraced in anthropology, because he was attempting to make universalist arguments about how cultures work. This was simply not accepted anymore, and in academic anthropology continues not to be accepted. But the problem with this is that this idea of cultures as these kind of self-contained systems was increasingly unviable because we live in the era in which the distinctions between cultures are being blurred, right? And so, the sort of return to these universalistic questions that Girard was posing is partly necessitated by things that few of us really deny anymore, like the fundamental interconnectedness of human societies, right? Whether we like it or not, that is the reality, right? And so the idea that we of an intellectual paradigm where we try to see them as completely self-contained and distinct seems largely exhausted, right? And so I think that's one way of thinking about why Girard is coming back into prominence, because he sort of dared to ask these universal questions that for a while were quite prescribed within academia.
Hey, what's up? If you enjoyed this video, take a second to subscribe to this YouTube channel. We publish videos like this several times a week. And also, if you're interested in studying the work of René Girard on your own, we made an awesome, totally free 18-page study guide that you can download at girardcourse.com. It's expertly curated. It's in a logical sequence that's going to help you master his entire body of work at your own pace. You can go ahead and get that at girardcourse.com. All right, that's all I got for you. Over and out.